Okay, Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Huh. This is going to be a deep dive. I mean, this book is like the foundation of libertarian thought, and just glancing at the table of contents, I can already tell it's going to be a lot to unpack.
Oh, it is. It's definitely dense. But the approach Nozick takes to this whole idea of the state is so interesting. He doesn't just jump in and say, here's the best form of government. He starts by asking, like, what if there were no government at all?
Oh, he just throws the whole system out the window and says, let's start from scratch. That's a bold move.
It is. It's this whole state of nature thing, right? A world with zero established government. From there, he explores how individuals would interact, how they'd protect their rights.
Makes you think of those classic survivalist scenarios, doesn't it? Everyone is out for themselves, chaos everywhere. But Nozick, he doesn't seem to buy into that whole inevitable chaos thing, does he?
Not really.
Mm.
He argues that people would naturally form these protective associations, almost like private security companies, protecting themselves, their property.
So it's not everyone running around with guns, it's more like banding together for protection. Makes sense. I mean, people crave security, right? Even without a state, you'd still want to protect what you have.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is Nozick suggests that as these protective associations compete and evolve, one might end up becoming dominant in an area, basically taking on the role of, like, a really minimal state.
Oh, so even without a government to begin with, some form of a state could just emerge organically, just from people wanting to feel safe and protect what's theirs. It's like totally flipping the script on how we think about government.
It really does. It challenges those traditional ideas about, like, where government comes from and why it even exists in the first place.
Totally. But okay, say this minimal state does emerge. What's to stop it from becoming just another power-hungry, tyrannical government?
That's where Nozick brings in moral constraints. He argues that people, just by being human, have these inherent rights that can't be violated, even by the state.
Yeah.
He's totally against sacrificing individual liberty, even for some greater good.
It's not just might makes right, then. Even in a minimal system, there have to be some boundaries, right? He makes that analogy about using a person as a tool, right? Even if you could achieve some huge benefit by sacrificing one person, Nozick would say, nope, that's fundamentally wrong.
Exactly. Individual rights, they're not bargaining chips to be traded away. This is a big deal because it sets some serious limits on what even a minimal state can do.
Makes you think about how this plays out in real life, Like, say the government wants to build a highway, right? It would benefit tons of people. But to do it, they got to demolish someone's home. Even if they pay the homeowner, Nozick would argue that taking their property against their will, that's still wrong.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It gets at that tension between individual rights and the collective good, which is like a major theme running through all of Nozick's work.
This whole moral constraints thing, super fascinating. But how do you actually enforce them, especially if the government's supposed to be minimal? Who decides what's okay and what's not?
Right. That's the tough part. And this is where Nozick really gets into the weeds, prohibiting certain actions, compensating victims, managing risk. He even talks about fear as this factor in deciding which actions should be prohibited.
Whoa, fear. But fear's so subjective. How do you even measure something like that? And how do you use that to make laws without creating all sorts of problems?
Exactly. He talks about how fear can really mess with rational thinking, how easily it can be manipulated, and how its subjective nature makes it really tricky to use as a basis for making laws. He even gets specific, like he talks about the fear of crime and how that can be used to justify policies that might actually chip away at people's freedoms.
So it's not just about saying anything that causes fear is bad and we should ban it. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
Way more nuanced. He really gets into this dilemma about allowing actions as long as you pay for the consequences. Like if someone is willing to pay up, does that make anything okay?
Sounds like that could lead to a really unequal system, right? Where the wealthy can just buy their way out of moral obligations. Does Nozick address that?
He does. He knows that just using money as the deciding factor, it's messy. Some things, he argues, are just plain wrong no matter what, like assault. You can't just pay your way out of that.
Yeah, I get that. Like if someone punches me and then offers to pay my medical bills, that doesn't really make it okay.
Right. He knows his point is that if anything goes as long as you can pay, then, like, what even are rights? Their value gets totally lost.
It's a good argument for having some sort of moral compass, something that goes beyond just, can I afford to do this, but I'm still stuck on this fear thing.
Yeah.
How does that play into Nozick's minimal state?
Well, he doesn't exactly give us a simple answer. What he does is force us to really think about these tough questions, to think about the trade-offs you have to make when you're trying to balance individual freedom with security and order in society.
Okay, so we've got the state of nature, these protective associations, moral constraints. How does all this lead to Nozick's minimal state?
It all fits together pretty neatly, actually. All these ideas lead him to argue that the only legitimate government is one that's super minimal, protecting individual rights, enforcing contracts. That's it. Anything more is stepping over the line.
So we're talking about a government that's like way smaller than what we're used to. No universal health care, no government-funded art programs.
Exactly. That's all outside the bounds of a minimal state, according to Nozick. And this brings us to another big concept, distributive justice. He is not a fan of what he calls patterned theories of justice.
Pattern theories? I'm not familiar with that. What does that even mean?
It's all about how resources get distributed, like wealth or income, based on certain ideas like need, merit, or equality. For example, a pattern theory might say everyone should have equal access to health care, no matter how much money they have, or that we should take from the rich to give to the poor to make things more fair.
Okay, I see. And Nozick disagrees with this.
Big time. He says any attempt to force a specific pattern, it's going to end up violating individual rights, and it'll lead to less freedom and prosperity for everybody.
So even if a pattern seems fair on the surface, trying to force it will always backfire.
That's the idea. And to show this, he uses this famous thought experiment called the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. Imagine a society where wealth is perfectly distributed. Everyone has an equal share. Now, in walks Wilt Chamberlain, basketball superstar. People want to see him play, so they willingly pay to watch him. And over time, Wilt ends up with way more wealth than everyone else just because people freely chose to give him their money.
So the pattern gets messed up just through regular transactions. What's Nozick's point here?
He's showing that any pattern, no matter how carefully you design it, it's always going to get disrupted by people making their own choices. And to keep that pattern, you'd need constant intervention, constant redistribution, which Nozick sees as taking away individual liberty.
It's like trying to hold back a flood. You can build walls and dams, but the water's going to find a way through eventually.
That's a great analogy. For Nozick, that water is individual liberty, and those walls are these patterned theories of justice that try to restrict it.
Okay, so we've laid out the groundwork for Nozick's minimal state. But he doesn't stop there, does he? He actually goes on to talk about utopia.
He does. But it's not the kind of utopia you might be picturing, like some perfect society for everyone.
So it's not some grand plan, a blueprint for the ideal state? Then what is it?
He calls it a framework for utopia. It's this world where people are free to create all sorts of different communities based on their own values and preferences.
So instead of one utopia for everyone, it's more like choose your own adventure. I kind of like that.
Exactly. He even uses the term meta-utopia to describe it. It's like, imagine a world where you can try out different ways of life, different communities, and if you don't like it, you can just leave.
That's a cool idea. It definitely fits with his whole emphasis on individual choice, you know? It's not about forcing one version of the good life on everyone. It's about giving people the space to figure out what makes them happy, what works for them.
And that's the heart of Nozick's vision. And he sees the state, especially a big, centralized one, as a potential roadblock to this kind of utopia. It would likely try to make things uniform, restrict people's choices. A minimal state, though, would get out of the way and let all this diversity flourish.
It's like he's saying, let 1,000 utopias bloom. But, okay, this is all very theoretical. How would this actually work in real life?
Well, Nozick admits there would be challenges, you know? He's not clueless about human nature or the fact that conflict can happen.
So he's not giving us a step-by-step guide to utopia, no utopia for dummies.
Nope. What he gives us is a set of principles, a way to think about the role of the state, individual rights, and how to build a more just and free society. He wants us to question what we think we know and consider different ways of organizing ourselves.
He's definitely given us a lot to chew on. But I gotta say, I'm still a little hesitant about this whole minimal state idea. It sounds good, but wouldn't we need some kind of safety net for people who are struggling, people who can't fully take care of themselves?
That's a valid concern, and Nozick actually addresses it. He's not saying we should just abandon people in need. He thinks private charity, those voluntary associations we talked about, and community initiatives, they can step up and help deal with poverty and other social problems.
But is that enough? Relying only on voluntary help, it just seems risky, especially for big, complex problems like poverty or healthcare.
It's definitely a point of debate. Critics argue that relying on charity alone, it's unreliable, you know? They might not be enough, and some people could fall through the cracks. They also worry that a minimal state wouldn't have the resources or power to handle things like environmental disasters, public health crises, or systemic inequalities.
So there's this tension, right, between Nozick's idea of individual liberty and the need to work together to solve big problems. It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. But even if you don't agree with everything he says, Nozick's work makes us face these really fundamental questions about the role of government, the limits of individual freedom, what a just society even looks like.
It's a challenge to think deeply about how we should live together, how to create a society that's both free and fair. Speaking of challenging ideas, Nozick also has this really interesting thought experiment, the experience machine, right?
Oh, yeah. That one will really make you think. Imagine a machine that could give you any experience you want.
Yes.
Success, love, adventure, anything you can dream up. And it's all without any real-world consequences.
Like the ultimate virtual reality, right? Live out your wildest fantasies, no risk or pain involved.
Exactly. The question Nozick asks is, would you plug into this machine, live out the rest of your life in a simulation, even if it's not real?
Honestly, part of me thinks it would be pretty tempting, especially if it meant avoiding all the bad stuff in real life. But then again, wouldn't something be missing? It wouldn't feel real, would it?
That's exactly Nozick's point. He thinks most people wouldn't choose to plug in, even if they could, because we care about authenticity, about real connection, about actually making choices and facing challenges, even if it's hard.
It's about more than just having fun or feeling good. It's about living a life that has meaning, even if it's messy and unpredictable.
Right. The experience machine shows us that a good life isn't just about maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. It's about living according to what you believe in, going after what you want, and making an actual difference in the world.
It makes you appreciate those real connections with people and how important it is to be part of the world, even with all the imperfections.
It does. And it connects back to what we were talking about before, about individual choice and self-determination. Plugging into that machine, it would be like giving up control of your life, letting the machine make all the decisions.
It'd be like choosing to live in a beautiful cage, even if you had the key to get out.
Perfect analogy. Nozick argues that true freedom isn't just about having choices. It's about being able to actually act on those choices and create your own life in the real world.
So even if this minimal state utopia sounds appealing, there's still that question, right? Would it actually allow for people to really thrive and live authentically, like Nozick seems to value?
It's a question worth thinking about, and it shows how complex Nozick's ideas really are. He's not giving us simple answers or solutions. He's making us wrestle with the tough choices we have to make when we're trying to balance individual freedom with what's best for society as a whole.
He's pushing us to rethink what it means to live a good life and what role the government should play in all of it.
That's what makes Anarchy, State, and Utopia so powerful. It starts conversations, challenges what you think you know, and gets you to really think about the world around you.
And it's a conversation that's still going on today, especially with all the debates about the government, our rights, and how to make society more just and fair.
Absolutely. Nozick's ideas are timeless in that way. They keep coming up because they deal with these fundamental questions about who we are, how power works, and what we can do to make things better.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. The state of nature, the minimal state, distributive justice, utopia, the experience machine. It feels like we've only scratched the surface of what Nozick is getting at.
We have. But hopefully we've given you a good taste of his ideas, how rich and complex they are.
But there's one more piece we need to look at. Moral constraints. And how they apply not just to the government, but to us as individuals. So we've talked about how Nozick applies these moral constraints to, like, what the government can do, but it feels like this concept goes beyond that. You know, it's not just about how governments act, it's about how we treat each other, person to person.
Absolutely. You're right on the money there. Nozick puts so much emphasis on individual rights, the idea that each person has inherent worth. It really makes you think about your own actions, how you impact others.
It's like he's saying you can't just excuse bad behavior by saying, well, the government allows it, or it's what everyone else does. We all have this responsibility to act ethically no matter what the law says or what's considered normal.
Exactly. And that's not always easy, is it? We're always facing choices where what we want might clash with what's right. Nozick doesn't give us like a rule book for these situations, but he does give us a framework, a way to think through those tough choices.
Okay, so say I'm trying to actually live by Nozick's ideas. What are some key takeaways, things I can put into practice in my own life?
Well, the first thing, the foundation, is recognizing that every single person has rights. rights that deserve respect. It's about treating people as valuable in themselves, not just as stepping stones to get what you want.
That sounds a lot like Kant, actually, that whole categorical imperative thing, treating people as ends in themselves, not just using them.
It's a powerful idea, for sure. And it applies everywhere, in your relationships, at work, even just interacting with strangers.
So it's not about those big heroic actions. It's the little things, being honest with people, respecting their time, thinking about how what you do might affect them.
Exactly. It's about being empathetic, realizing that your choices have ripples. They go beyond just you.
It makes you think about those times when it's tempting to compromise your values, just to make things easier or to get ahead. Nozick's focus on moral constraints, it's like he's saying there are some lines you just shouldn't cross, even if it means missing out on something.
That's a really important point. He reminds us that being ethical, having integrity, it's not just some lofty idea. It takes effort. It takes making tough choices sometimes.
And it's not about being perfect or acting all self-righteous. It's about trying to live by your values and owning up to your actions even when you mess up.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a journey. It's about constantly learning and growing. And that's one of the most valuable things about Nozick's work, I think. He doesn't give you all the answers, but he pushes you to really think about what it means to be a good person, both as an individual and as part of a society.
It's like a call to action, right? To look at your own beliefs, be more aware of what you do, and work towards a world where individual rights and ethical principles are at the heart of every decision.
And in a world where those principles are often being challenged, that message is more important now than ever.
This deep dive into anarchy, state, and utopia, it's been really thought-provoking. Nozick's ideas, they're challenging, sometimes they make you uncomfortable, but they're also really inspiring.
He's definitely one of those thinkers who makes you question everything you thought you knew, see things in a new way. And even if you don't agree with him on everything, his work leaves you with this deeper understanding of what it means to be human, the challenges of building a just world, and how crucial individual liberty and moral responsibility really are. It's a book that sticks with you, that's for sure.